She is on her way, but I feel we have got a lot to cover, so I would like to get underway and say straight away, good afternoon everybody, and thank you for not taking advantage of this stunning weather and going out skiing. The title of the session, you all know, just to remind you, Leveraging Technology for the Bottom Line. The questions to answer are how will future IT spending change in the coming years, and are businesses able to maximize the returns on their existing investments? Well, if I knew the answer to the first question, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be on the phone to my stockbroker, I assure you of that. But I don't. So I'll be asking these technology titans alongside me, or panelists as we call them at the forum. And hopefully they do know and be able to tell us and how they believe future IT budgets will be spent. At least they better, otherwise it'll be a very short session indeed. I suppose just in case they can't, hopefully they'll know how businesses, not just theirs, can maximize the returns. I want to begin with some good news as I see it. After what feels like, I'm sure, to a lot of people, an eternity of belt-tightening, company spending, from what I can gauge on IT, does seem to be staging a bit of a rebound. Now, how strong that rebound is or will be is yet to be seen. Now, as a result, consultants and developers looking to take advantage of any upturn are welcome. Will need to base all their work around that popular term today, which we all know, ROI, return on investment. Now, I don't want to preempt what Carly Fiorina has to say. And by the way, Carly, congratulations on being voted the 9th most respected businesswoman in the world. And I don't know if there's any truth that Arnold Schwarzenegger is going to get rid of the other 8. But I no doubt Carly will tell me. I noticed a few weeks ago... Absolute, a person. I noticed a few weeks ago that Hewlett-Packard says it's surprised by the strength in recent sales of corporate computers, servers. According to one VP I talked to in London, every 4 minutes, he told me, we ship an industry-standard server in the UK. Now, by my calculations, that adds up to about 3,500 a week. So the first question to Carly is, where do they all go?
Well, let me add another statistic to that that's equally interesting. More frequently than once a second, someone buys an HP printer. And so from the one end in corporate enterprise with industry standard servers all the way to the consumer end with printers, people are buying a lot of technology. I want to say first that I think we have to think about this decade of technology differently than we thought about the last decade. There's no question that spending is returning, but there's equally no question that this decade of technology will look quite different from the last decade of technology. And the reason for that is several-fold. First, technology is becoming an integral part of every business and increasingly every life. And so people, whether they are consumers or chief information officers in big companies, realize that their competitiveness depends very much on their use of technology. At the same time, they realize that this is not simply anymore about hot boxes and killer apps and who has the fastest, best, or even in some cases cheapest piece of hardware or piece of software. Increasingly, it is about tying what have been different islands of technology together. And you asked, where are the servers going? I would say there are 3 fundamental things happening in technology that are driving sales now, but also creating a different era of technology. First, and very importantly, every process, every physical analog process will become digital, mobile, and virtual. Every process, whether it's supply chain or photography, whether it's a consumer process like photography or an enterprise process like supply chain, every process will become digital, mobile, and virtual. But second, the requirement for simplicity and manageability is getting to be paramount now. People need this stuff to work together, and they need it to work together better than in the past, and they need it to be easier to use and easier to manage. And finally, one of the key reasons this era of technology is different than the last is people are putting a premium now on interoperability and connection. It's all the value in many enterprises is no longer about building yet another standalone island of technology or a standalone application or a standalone process. The value in an enterprise increasingly now is how do I make processes work together? How do I make applications work together? How do I hook up my suppliers to my customers, to my employees? That's all about horizontal connection, and it requires interoperability between heterogeneous kinds of technology. By the way, the same thing is true in the home. Consumers, the digital revolution that's going to go on in the home requires what have been separate islands of technology, one in the living room, one in the study, to be brought together around something like, for example, a digital entertainment experience. We see four things driving, in particular, sales of industry standard products. When customers really are leveraging the power of technology, not only are they thinking about it as the digitization of processes, but they also increasingly know that to get maximum value out of technology, they have to do four things. They have to simplify their technology environment. They have to standardize their technology environment. They have to modularize their technology environment. By modularize, I mean create a pool of resources that can be used flexibly instead of having technology dedicated to a single process or a single application. And finally, they need to integrate it all. Simplify, standardize, modularize, and integrate. Those are very different requirements than in the 90s when it was, I'm going to throw technology at a problem like it's a silver bullet. I'm focused on speed and flexibility above everything else, and I'll worry about whether it works together later.
And of course, the big priority, as everybody's concerned, is to make the technology actually work. Now,
and to deliver an improving return.
Yeah, and exactly that as well in terms of corporate thinking. You've set out your stall a little, Carly, but you can come back in on this now if you like. But what I think would be easiest would be to go along the panel so everybody can set out their stall. Laura, I did mention this to the other panelists just to say, so I'm sure you have something to contribute on this one as well. Just to sort of, by that I mean talk for a few minutes about how your IT spending will change, or how you think it will change in the coming years. And Gary, let's kick off with you.
Sure. Well, it's interesting when you look at IT spending and you think about how it's going to change. I don't think we're going to return to kind of an abnormal exuberance that led to the big bubble. I think we're heading down the path of a pretty measured recovery. You know, first of all, there's been a lot of price changes and economic changes in the model. You know, in many cases, hardware, if you look at my industry, storage in particular, prices have come down dramatically. You know, from 20 cents a megabyte 3-4 years ago today to 3-4 cents a megabyte at the most. So with rapidly falling prices, it's going to be hard to spend as much money as was being thrown at the problem. I completely agree with Carly on the, you know, people are looking for capacity and making sure they are ahead of a growing curve 5 years ago. And when we go into the next decade, the next 10 years, and it's going to be a measured recovery because people are going to be applying technology to real problems, and they are going to measure ROI. They're going to make sure they're getting a real return on that investment. And you know, when Carly talks about these islands of data and islands of operations, the reality is there are no more islands. It is all interconnected today. It's interconnected by networks. It's interconnected by data models. It's interconnected by business processes. So IT, when you look across the industry, is a series of interconnections not only within a company, but with your suppliers and with your partners and with your customers. And so this interconnection drives it forward. And you know, when you take all this, the simplicity, modularization, integration, you know, we come from a viewpoint of the world's heterogeneous. That's what we specialize in, is software that ties together heterogeneous environments. But when you put all that together and you put all those characteristics together, what it's really saying is there's an expectation in the industry today, or really in the consumer of IT today, especially in corporations, that says, as vendors, we need to take the complexity out of IT. And if we get the complexity out, then there's a true return on investment. Otherwise, the complexity and the cost of labor managing these environments is really overtaking any of the return they might get in their business. And so we have to eliminate complexity out of the industry.
Carly, you've answered to a certain extent in terms of setting out your stall. Perhaps a more relevant question would be, how has your corporate spending changed since the link up with Compact?
So it's changed.
Or will change.
Yeah. The nature of what we spend our money on has changed. Now, obviously, when we first acquired Compact, we had an opportunity to eliminate duplication. And so we could eliminate data centers. And in that particular instance, we saw the overall IT budget decrease a bit. But fundamentally, we think that companies now need to look at their technology not only as delivering a improving return, we call it return on IT. Customers should demand a constantly improving return on IT, but they also should be looking for, of course, quality and reliability and security and manageability, and they should be looking for one other thing, which we would describe as adaptability. And so we think the goal here is to build an adaptive enterprise and to use technology to increase the agility and ability to change of a company. Now, when we took that approach to our own company, and by the way, as a strategic goal, we believe we have to be a maximum user of our own products, our own services, our own software, our own people. When we took the adaptive enterprise approach to our own company and said we had to simplify and standardize and modularize and integrate, we were able to cut our total IT budget beyond the normal integration kinds of savings by 25%. And get greater utility and capacity and adaptability out of the technology that we spent money on. Going into 2004, you'll see our IT budgets will probably rise in the low single digits, candidly. It's not going to be a 5 to 10% jump. It's going to be more like 1 to 3 or 2 to 4. And frankly, I personally think 4% is on the high side for most enterprises. And the reason it's on the high side, again, is because there's still an opportunity to make the underlying technology infrastructure more efficient, more effective by taking complexity out, by relying, we believe as well, that heterogeneity is the name of the game. It's not about making everything homogeneous. You lose capability and flexibility in a homogeneous world. Much better to have heterogeneity. But there's a lot of opportunity to improve efficiency and effectiveness within a relatively small budget increase.
Okay, thank you, Carly. Gary. John, sorry.
Okay, no problem. Creating a little bit of controversy, I think, is always fun. We have an unlimited IT budget. I believe that IT is the enabler of the business strategy, and it is the key driver of productivity. Laura, you and I have been talking for 6 years about, can you drive productivity of a country at 2 to 3% per year, and that not being the stretch goal, but 3 to 5% being probable, and it now looks like 3 to 5% may be sustainable for a decade. That well-run companies will drive productivity at between 5 and 10%. Cisco will drive our own productivity at between 10 to 15%. If you do those numbers off of a base of 40% operating expenses or 35%, whether I spend an extra 5 or 10% on IT is irrelevant. Let's say 5% of my budget goes to IT directly and indirectly. So whether it's 4.5 or 5.5 is irrelevant if I can drive my productivity of the bigger number at 10 to 15%. So what I think you're going to see drive IT expenditures is an understanding of business and government leaders around the world at the macro level that you can drive productivity at numbers we've not imagined before. You will see that explode then down by industry. And by industry, it will be based upon the industry's ability to absorb the technology. You will see industries such as high tech, retail, financial services be early on, but that's because their supply chain, their employees, and their customers are early adopters of it. You will see it roll through each of the industries over a period of time, and I think the productivity numbers I talk about will go comparably across the group. Then you will see certain companies break away within an industry. We have twice the productivity of our nearest competitor at Cisco, who does systems business, and yet we will drive our productivity, as I alluded to earlier, at 10 to 15% a year for the next 5 years. We will drive that not only in terms of the bottom line, but at the same time free up resources and move into new technology, which don't even count towards productivity. We've realigned half of our R&D resource, as an example, over the last 3 years for projects that are beyond 3 years out, which have no effect on the productivity line. Then it will be by individual functional groups. What traditionally we've seen in customer services being the quickest hit in terms of productivity leverage. Then you see areas such as supply chain management, workforce optimization, e-learning. And then you'll bring that down across functions, which I think is where the key productivity for the second half of this decade will be. First half in functional groups, second half across the functions, and then you'll bring it down to the individual. I think it's going to be the opposite. I don't think our challenge will be technology capability. And if we come down Moore's Law at the speed that I think we will within the industry, you will be talking about if you can improve the price performance of a product every 18 months, trying to squeeze the last 10% of the product out is not cost effective in terms of the support costs it takes. And when you look at CEOs' ability to adjust to the changes we said, or individual groups' view of what are the complexity, the number one issue is organizational and people. That's 50% of their worry. Are they making the organizational changes in people? 25% is about, are you making the fundamental process change? 15% is about the technology integration, which we in the technology world tend to focus on, and only 7% have technology capability. So I think if you're going to get the productivity and the enabling of business strategy I talked about, I think you're going to see fundamental change in terms of how people view IT, and I think the budgets may go up faster than people anticipate, but the real drivers will be how effective is the CEO or country leader in terms of outlining their business strategy and then using IT to implement it.
Thank you. An unlimited IT budget.
Unlimited IT budget. They just can't spend it on brick and mortar and people.
Hands up anybody who's jealous.
I'll put my hand up.
All right. Laura.
Certainly at London Business School, and I would say at most UK university system, do not have unlimited IT budget. If I did, I think I'd talk to you about how to use it. I think I will just say a couple of things that sort of put a somewhat broader perspective on it, because what I am essentially a CEO of is an educational institution with a limited IT budget because of a limited revenue base. So the broader context would be just a couple of thoughts. Number one, when John and I started a few years ago being the sort of among the productivity optimists, and Business Week was also a productivity optimist. I see Bruce Nussbaum back there. My profession was in general quite skeptical of the view that the increase in IT investment as a share of total investment in the United States, which was clear, and which happened to be in timing associated with a pickup in productivity, my profession said, well, look, this may not be causality at all. We have to wait and see. And furthermore, it may not be sustainable. We have to wait and see. And furthermore, the effect may not be that big. We have to wait and see. And I would say that now, basically 7 years later, when you kind of look at the numbers through the boom, through the slowdown, through the recovery, the evidence is mounting at the macro level, both within the United States, and also there's a lot of interesting cross-country analysis that's been done showing that there really has been a noticeable and causal link between an increase in IT spend and a pickup in national productivity rates where it has occurred. There's also been a lot of firm-level analysis. So there's country-level analysis, which has established that, and there's firm-level analysis, which has established that. So you can listen to a story like the story of HP, or you can listen to a story like the story of Cisco. You can go and look at a whole data set that a number of scholars have collected at MIT, for example, where they've looked at a large number of firms and essentially drawn that link carefully. Now, one of the things that the evidence shows is that there actually is, understandably, when you think about it, a lag between the spend on on IT and the productivity effects. They don't all happen overnight. And indeed, oftentimes what happens is that the lag involves not just the spend on the hardware, But then there's a spend on the software, there's a spend on the customization of the software, there's a spend on the organizational redesign, and there's a spend on the training of the workforce around the organizational redesign, around the software configuration, around the hardware. It goes to Carly's customization point, and that takes time. And so what's happened is, as time has gone by, the productivity effects have actually been enhanced because firms figure out the way to do this. Now, that suggests actually some very important sort of policy issues. For example, I just spent a morning in a discussion about the Eurozone, and there is a lot of debate about first of all, the IT spend pickup was not as great in Europe as it was in the U.S. And second of all, the productivity effects at either the firm level or the national level don't seem to be as large. Why? Well, that may reflect a number of constraints on the ability of firms to reorganize around the technology. It just takes longer because these barriers to reorganization, whether they're barriers of workplace organization or barriers of labor rules or barriers of just less willingness to change. I'm not going to suggest there's any particular explanation, but there really is evidence that the more flexible the organization, the more flexible the national economy, the greater the return and the faster the return in productivity to an IT spend. It's not IT spend by itself, it's IT spend with the structural flexibility. So I think that's very important to emphasize. The other thing I want to say is just there's a very interesting concept that's been developing now, which would suggest that actually we will see a real pickup, a further boost to IT spending coming from the globalization of the software industry. And the argument is something like this. One of the things that drove the IT investment in the 1990s and the diffusion of the technology, whether it was in the firm or in the household, was the very rapid decline in the price of the product. I mean, price falls. People actually say, gee, I'm going to substitute more of this cheaper thing. It generates productivity. I will move my organization. So now if you project out and you say one of the things that's going to happen as a result of the globalization of the software industry is the price of software is going to fall very fast. Software is, remember, complementary to hardware. It's going to drive even faster, greater usage of the total package of IT. And the view is that, that will mean that small and medium-sized firms who probably, the cost of doing this, of setting up and reorganizing their production process around IT, might look very forbidding on the software price, hardware price terms that were available in the late 1990s.
Right.
Maybe it's going to look very attractive in the next few years, and then you're going to actually see a significant pickup in the spend. And I would say this also goes for the household as well. You go from the large enterprise, which has gone very far in this regard with the unlimited IT
Laura,
spend.
that's going back to the theme I wanted to come to later about the consumer coming back as more powerful. That's
so
pretty
why don't I
good.
just stop right there?
Why don't you? And John, why don't you?
Okay. Well, you'll find this panel actually agrees a lot more than the first comments through. We're all approaching the problem at different parallel paths. And Laura had the productivity early on. You are seeing Europe, and I'm not talking about any of our earnings, and I'm in the quiet zone as an example, so nothing I say should be interpreted good or bad about this quarter. But you are seeing expenditures in Europe start to pick up, and perhaps with an understanding of government and business that they fell behind earlier with a focus on productivity and a realization that if regardless of which country you're in the world, if you don't improve your productivity, your standard of living goes down versus your industry peers. Carly's right on the budget. I think you are going to see the budget conservative this year. I think we've gone through 3 years where we rewarded the CIO for cutting back on budget as opposed to saying how much productivity do you bring me to the bottom line. But as CEOs regain their confidence and get aggressive, granted at a slower pace than any of us want, I think you'll begin to see them approach it more in the total picture as opposed to elements. Gary's also right that the quicker vendors can either work together on their products toward common architectures and ease of use, or the more companies who do the systems integration and enable our customers to do this, the more technology they can consume. So I think you're going to see IT literally drive business strategy and new business models.
Gary, globalization means lower software prices. That's good news, isn't it?
Well, it's a question if you buy that or not. Yeah, it's interesting on globalization relative to software prices. The question is, where is money predominantly being spent in IT today? And it's not on the hardware, and it's not on software. Most of it, the money being spent in IT, is the labor associated with running it. And so the question is, what are the leverage points in order to bring down the cost of the labor? And I would argue that it's software that's going to inherently reduce the labor costs associated with it. And actually, while we talk about business productivity of IT, there's a productivity of IT issue as well, because IT as an industry is not the most productive industry. So when you get into a typical IT shop, if you can use software, you can tie systems together, you can more efficiently operate them, then you can make that a more efficient service, more efficient utility, if you want to call it that, more efficient offering to the business. And CIOs are being held accountable to drive productivity out of IT while at the same time deploying more applications to actually run the business. So I think there's a pretty significant trade-off there that you've got to be careful on. The other, I think, kind of care or cautionary note I would put on the discussion is around budgets versus spending. Because if we roll the clock back over the past 3 years, we predominantly did not have a budget problem. We had a spending problem. Most of my customers, had they spent the budgets that were allocated to them, we would never have had the magnitude of the downfall in the market that we saw in IT. The reality is they were afraid to spend their budgets. And as John said, we've been chasing our CIOs. I'm sure John chases his, I chase mine, as do my customers, to drive cost out. And it's going to take them a while to kind of reinvigorate and say, well, now I'm going to go back to investment mode, and I'm going to start pouring money back into this. And the way that they're going to deal with that...
Investment on what? R&D? Or
well, ultimately, the question is, what's the CIO? If you think of that as a corporate representative of IT, what are they really interested in doing? Deploying more business applications, deploying the things that make the business operate more efficiently, better information about your customers, better business processes, new avenues and new channels to market. IT is not there as kind of a playground of technology. It's there for business value. But today what's happening is all the complexity of the environment is where the money is going. They don't have adequate dollars to actually invest in the applications.
Carly?
So I think there are a couple things that maybe I can tie together. First, I think every CEO and CIO, to John's point, will spend as much money on IT as they can demonstrate return on that investment in business productivity. I think one of the reasons that IT budgets slowed during the downturn, or spending was even lower than the budgets, is because people have learned that spending on technology does not necessarily mean investing in productivity. The subject of management, if you look at where people spend their money, a lot of customers, for example, spend a lot of time driving the cost of hardware down. But if you look at something as basic as a desktop, the cost of the hardware on a desktop is 30 cents on the dollar. 70 cents on that dollar is managing the desktop. Now, figuring out how to manage effectively the desktop, the hardware, the applications, the help desk, the inventory of PCs. Everyone has figured out they probably have more PCs than they do employees, for example. That whole management issue is a bit more complex problem. And it takes, therefore, more thinking, more time to work your way through. It is, I think, also undeniable that getting productivity out of technology not only requires tackling the whole problem, it's not just the hardware, it's the applications, it's the management, it's the processes, and tackling the whole problem is a more complex problem than just going at it a box or an application at a time.
So you've got to think outside the box.
Well, you have to think more holistically.
When you were appointed in '99, and you said you were a person who's willing to take risks.
Well, I think that's undeniably true.
So tell us more about the risks you're taking now.
So you're trying to change the subject. I get that feeling. Well, to just finish the thought for a moment, and I do think, let me try and connect it to your comment about risk-taking. Spending money on technology alone doesn't yield productivity gains. To get productivity gains, you have to change the work as well as change the technology. Changing the work means you have to have the ability to take risks and redesign process, redesign how people are organized, redesign how people interoperate, redesign how you as a company interact with other companies. All that implies change. And I think one of the big things that perhaps the technology industry has not done as good a job of as we should is to be candid and say that the creation of productivity through the investment in technology takes at least an equal investment in change management. If you're not willing to take the risks to change how your company operates, you won't get the benefit out of technology. And so, in fact, running a productive enterprise takes a risk-taking mentality every day. Not foolish risk, not imprudent risk, but the ability to say, I'm going to proactively use change to create a more effective enterprise.
I see the dean over there of the Sloan School at MIT, and I'm going to quote a study, and this is the study that Eric did with his, they've actually looked at a group of firms on this, and it's actually something like $1 of hardware supported by $4 to spend on software and $5 of spend on organizational change. And the organizational change is everything from retraining the workforce to changing the configuration of the building to bringing in new, management consultants to help you figure out what to do. It is a significant additional investment, and firms that get it and do that get the productivity gains, and firms that don't are very disappointed. So you have to, one of the things that the hardware vendors and the software suppliers obviously I think have realized is the more you work with a customer to get the customer to understand what they need to do to get the productivity enhancements, the better your market is going to be.
Hopefully. John?
Yeah, it's going to also be interesting to watch to see how the mentality of businesses change. I think you have got the government and business leaders understanding the potential leverage. During this time period of contracting, we actually focused on IT budgets going down, but also the cycle on payback of projects had to be 12 to 18 months. And that still exists today. It's one of the reasons you don't see IT budgets growing as much this next year. My own view is most of the big payback applications we've ever done, we got payback, whether you call it delayed effect of technology investment or enabling the process and driving it through. We got more payback in years 4 through 6 than 1 through 3, and 7 through 9 more than 4 through 6. The point that I'm making is that if CIOs stay on the 12 to 18-month mentality, as opposed to say it's got to be an evolutionary process, then we won't see the IT spends or the productivity leverage points. And right now, it's a more conservative environment than perhaps you would get in a normal economic recovery.
Carly, do you see non-IT companies generally being bullish about the value of IT spending and therefore prepared to raise their budgets accordingly?
I certainly see non-IT companies being bullish on the impact of IT. And I think that's across the board, across every industry. I actually even think you see consumers being bullish on IT. Consumers are clearly willing to spend money on technology. But I also think that CEOs, CIOs, and mom and dad or the kids at home all have gotten more sophisticated and more realistic about what spending on technology means. And when I say more sophisticated, I mean they now know that they shouldn't necessarily trade off the things they used to trade off. They shouldn't have to trade off improving return with innovation. They shouldn't have to trade off quality and reliability with flexibility. They shouldn't have to trade off functionality for simplicity or manageability. They should actually be able to try and get all of those things. And so customers are getting more demanding, more sophisticated about technology. I think they are also getting more realistic in the sense that they know that it's not a silver bullet. They know that it has to interact with other things and that it is going to have to cause them to think differently about how they operate.
Gary, do you think non-IT companies believe IT is still a source of strategic advantage?
Oh, I think they do. I think, you asked the question a second ago about being more bullish. I think they've become more vocal I don't know about more bullish. They're looking for, am I getting real value out of IT? Am I getting the return? And I think a lot of this delayed return on investment is what John and Carly talked about, which is the change process that goes on in a company in order to adopt a new technology. Good example is you can put up a Salesforce automation system, but if your sales reps don't want management to know who they're calling on, what they're discussing with their customers, they don't put any data in it. So until you change the culture into which it's an open environment to share that information, you could wait years for that sales automation system, as an example, to really pay off. So what we have is we have a real practical issue of not everybody in a corporation sees the value of IT. The IT leaders themselves are kind of looking at the complexity, saying it's difficult to get the return to the business. And then the CEOs and the CIOs are really holding the business leaders accountable for, are you going to use it? Is it really going to help your business? And is the business benefit really coming? And so relative to the question of, is there competitive advantage done properly, I think there's enormous competitive advantage. You can look at some of the manufacturing companies and others that have grown their business rapidly through, whether it be online sales or whether it just be better information about their customers. So there's numerous examples out in the industry of successful IT organizations that drove business benefit. But a lot of that comes back to the earlier comment I had, which is we have to start changing the metrics of computing a little bit such that more of that money is going into the applications to build the business advantage. And the only way to do that is get rid of the complexity and lower the cost of labor associated with running IT.
John?
We had a CEO-CIO session last March, and in the room we only had 45 global customers, of which 30 were from the U.S. But out of that 30, it represented over half the Dow Jones Industrial Average and way over half the NASDAQ average. Now, what that in essence says is those are the most profitable companies from around the world. The CIOs at the end of the session, I think was already there at the beginning, the CEOs were actually the ones who said it. We use IT to enable our business strategy. And so what I'm really saying is it goes across all industries. I think that decision's already done. Gary made a comment earlier when I first heard it. I said, no, it wasn't accurate. And then I thought about it. He was right. IT organizations tend to be like the shoemaker's kids. Well, the McKinsey study was right. IT as a whole got good productivity. It was probably a handful of companies that got that productivity, with the majority of companies not doing it. Carly's really driven productivity in her company. I have in mine. Gary has in his. But it's been more the exception. So I actually think the productivity leverage from IT will go across many industries, and our industry tends to be, at times, actually a laggard in it, surprisingly enough.
Laura, we talked about the customer. And Carly and I were talking briefly about the comparison in Vegas last week between CES and Comdex, and how I thought CES was more important and more realistic today, with the customer increasingly, it seems to me, in the driver's seat. The consumer in the driver's seat. Tech companies have to come to grips with that kind of reality, are they?
That's a question that I actually don't. I think that Carly and John, the other members of the panel, are better to answer that. What I would say is,
well, you think it's too consumer focused?
It's too consumer focused. I don't know. I was struck by Carly's statement. She reiterated a number of times in what she said the importance of the consumer market and the increasing sophistication of the consumer user. I've tended to focus in my own work on the sort of business user and how they need to have a certain level of sophistication in order to get all of the benefits out of the technology. So that's why, in a sense, the question I would toss back to Carly and say, my sense is that, if you're in a consumer business and you have increasingly sophisticated users of technology among your consumers, and your business is competitive, which is basically, I think, a situation of increasing competitive intensity throughout most sectors of the economy because of globalization technology, then you are going to have to be increasingly responsive. I mean, it's very competitive. Your customers are increasingly sophisticated. I assume that if you're a well-managed company, you are going to respond to that. So let me answer it in that general way.
Well, does that, would my question say, how are you going to change the perception, perhaps, Carly, of HP as less of a box shifter and more, perhaps, as a provider of solutions?
So first, let me say HP has a vital interest in the consumer market because we are today the largest consumer IT company in the world. Very few people know, but we are almost a $20 billion consumer company. And, all those printers I was talking about and PCs and handhelds, all of those, a huge portion of those go into the consumer space. And at the Consumer Electronics Show 2 weeks ago, we announced our major strategy and product roadmap for digital entertainment. Remember the comment I made at the outset, every process will become digital, mobile, and virtual. It is how we have driven digital photography, entertainment, music, video, photography. Every one of those processes are going to become digital and mobile and virtual, and that revolution will happen in the home. So it's a huge market for the adoption of technology, and consumers actually are anxious and willing to take on the technology, but they don't have an IT department sitting in their kitchen, so therefore this requirement for simplicity and manageability and interoperability where it all works together is really important. It's one of the reasons we announced a digital entertainment system that allows a consumer literally to access and manage and distribute and edit any kind of digital content from any source in a seamless way. However, I would also say that there are some characteristics about the consumer market that are different from the enterprise market. One of the characteristics about the consumer market is a premium on simplicity. The hardest engineering feat in the world is to make something complex simple.
That's right.
That's why it took us 100 patents to create a $49 printer.
And then explain it simply to the public.
Well, frankly, in the consumer world, you'd rather not have to explain it. You'd rather it be as intuitive as possible and something that just works. But the other thing that's different about the consumer market is scope and scale matter a lot. Brand matters a lot. And so the ability to distribute broadly in a consumer space, the ability to build brands is equally important, I think, to the technology capability. And that's why, you, to your point of image, we have spent a lot of time and money building the HP brand, and will continue to do that. And a consumer brand is, by its nature, a bit different. It's a different personality in some ways than an enterprise brand. And of course, we are a company in both spaces, and so we have to be mindful of those differences and yet have a brand that altogether has some common characteristics.
Gary?
So I'm going to jump out of my school of the enterprise for a little while and kind of just give you an example on this consumer front, which is, I think, part of the simplicity issue of consumer-based technology is going to solve itself really by the generational change of people and their access to technology. If I look at my father buying an HP printer, I'm a very expensive help desk, and I have to spend hours with them, helping them connect it, plug in the wires, everything else over the telephone. If I look at the other end of the generation and look at my son at 12 years old, and he's calling me up telling me which model of HP printer to buy and telling me why he needs a new Dell computer on his desktop instead of the old one.
My help desk, I have to say.
And so what happens is if you look at the variation of comfort with technology, this notion that consumer technologies could get simpler, part of it's just going to happen is there's a generation growing up now that understands technology, inherently more comfortable with it, more access to it, clearly not in all parts of the world, but in many parts of the world. And so they're just the increasing level of simplicity is somewhat coming from familiarity as best as anything. So I think some of that problem starts solving itself. The good news for all of that is all that comfort with technology. When you think about the next generation business leaders, they're going to look to technology just as it makes their personal life easier today as consumers, whether it be in high schools or in middle schools or at their social life, which is probably more important to them. It's going to, their viewpoint on this being a good productive tool is going to be pretty good by the time they get up to become business leaders.
Can I just let John come in on that, and then Laura, I'll come to you.
Okay. Well, I like the question, and when you think through it, I think they're going to be successful high-tech companies who are 100% customer-driven. That's our philosophy. There are going to be some that really believe by the time your customers see it, it's too late. So what they think about is how do I get ahead of the customer and generate the product. And there will be a third category that will be really fast followers. All three work. And if you're world-class, you've got to understand two things. First, you've got to understand what your core competency is that you have. And if you can do two of those, I think you're very well positioned. But I actually think, Stephen, all three of them work. And in this environment, I think you'll see successful high-tech companies break into all three categories.
Okay.
Laura.
I had a question, but I'll pose it in the way of a couple of examples. It involves, as you move into this rapidly expanding consumer market, it's the issue about the bottom line. The margins on these products may not be very high. In order to penetrate large numbers of potential consumers around the world, you cannot have particularly pricey products. And in thinking about this, I'm sort of thinking about the world of, it used to be the case. We've moved, as Carly has said, in the photography area from film to digital. So I'm on the board of Kodak. Everyone knows the situation that basically there were huge margins on silver halide traditional photography, and there are very, very small margins, extremely small margins, fairly non-existent in the area. And I take the iPod now as an example because I know about, my latest watching my son was, open the iPod and in 2 minutes it was all fine and everything was going. And he was also working on a telephone for my husband at the same time. So he's doing two things at once. But the point is that in order to get that is a high margin, high design product right now. But you can already see it's going to become a low margin product as it filters around the world. So I guess I want to ask the consumer folks about what they think the sustainability of margins are in the consumer business.
Okay, that's a good enough question. Carly?
So I actually think there's a lot of confusion between low margin and high scale. It is not the case that high volume consumer products are necessarily lower margin than enterprise products. In fact, if you looked at our PC business, and your son knows that we just overtook Dell as the #1 PC player.
I knew I was in trouble.
There's always a plug, isn't there?
If you look at the PC business, for example, our margins in the consumer PC part of our business are higher than our margins in the commercial PC business. Now, why is that? First, because scope and scale, big scope and scale, sometimes frequently drives improving margins. And secondly, because the difference in the consumer market to the enterprise market is big enterprises have a different level of buying power than an individual consumer. And so I think it's not accurate to say that consumer markets are by their nature lower margin. What absolutely is accurate is that to penetrate a consumer market, you have to have products at a wide variety of price points, including entry-level price points.
I was thinking about you think about what's happened to sort of, color television as an example. All of these products that have started out as high-margin new products in the consumer electronics space, and by now you have many, many suppliers at very low prices. That's why, by the way, I was going to say I think your branding strategy is exactly right, because my prediction would be the only way you maintain high margins in this market over time is design. So, the sort of iPod design, so kids are willing to get their parents to pay for a huge amount just for the design, or you get the brand. So the brand itself says, I will spend extra because I'm getting an HP computer as opposed to a knockoff of something.
Or you are innovating to add new value, because it is clearly true that consumers are willing to spend money on technology that gives them new functionality that they've not had before. Ultimately, products that are familiar and have been around a long time and don't provide anything new and different, like a television, ultimately those commoditize, without a doubt.
Yeah, that's all.
But this Christmas season and the Christmas season previously clearly demonstrated that customers were willing to pay a premium for something new, like, for example, a digital camera.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
John, I'll take your point, but I want to throw it open after John's made his point.
I think we're dealing with a combination of items. I think first, in any area of high tech, you've got to come down Moore's Law, which by definition means if you don't lower your costs or add dramatically more function, it will cut your profits in half or cut your revenues in half every 18 months. The second is the better that you can keep ahead of your competition, the more price premium that goes with it. The third is it's associated with brand directly and indirectly. If you combine software and hardware and functionality, you get a dramatically higher margin than you do either one by itself. And the fourth is something that I think we all struggle with, is what does your brand both represent in terms of quality but also support. So when we moved in the consumer market, we went with a different brand. We went Linksys. And in the consumer market, my margins are lower than my margins in the enterprise, obviously, but my operating expenses, instead of being at 40, are at 10. So my actual profit margins are relatively close. My support model is also different with the brand. My support costs cost $3 per call. At Linksys, they cost me $250 per call for the enterprise. And so branding, margin, software, it's a complex equation. There isn't just one factor that goes with it, Stephen.
I think we're sort of well aware of what some of the must-have brands are for teenagers or some consumers. What about your customers? What are the must-have brands or must-have technology that your customers want?
Well, when you look into the future, what customers are telling us they're going to spend money on, security is at the top of the list. They're becoming completely dependent upon technology. They understand that, but they're also saying, I need security, and it can't be elements of it. There's got to be an architecture on it. Secondly, wireless is really hot. Go ahead.
Well, I was wondering where the money to be made is from wireless, personally, but...
Well, we make great margins in wireless.
Well, I think it's across the board.
No, I think we make money at the enterprise level in wireless. We make money at the consumer level. What you may be referring to is the mobile market as a whole in a very competitive environment where we haven't been able to establish differentiators.
I wasn't thinking Cisco so much as the general environment of wireless. But let's throw it open to the floor. And we'll start with this young lady over here, because normally if I wait till the end, everybody's forgotten what they're going to ask. So let's start now. And can you identify who you are and who you'd like to answer the question?
Yeah, I'm Hind Bahwan from Oman. I'm an entrepreneur. My question is to the IT giants here.
Titans.
Yes. You know, the Middle East might not be your big market today, but if you look at the future, you know, if you look at spending on this area, in terms of, you know, your budgets for the future, I think that would be a huge market. So my question is, what's your plans for the Middle East, if you have any?
And anybody in particular you'd like to answer that?
Well, I have both of them.
All right, well, let's start with Carly. You kick off.
So first, the Middle East is actually our fastest growing region today, so I absolutely agree with you about its growth potential. Secondly, we are today the largest IT company in the Middle East, and we want to maintain and grow that position. We have some manufacturing in the Middle East that we've just invested in 2003. We have mostly sales and service. We have a wide range of partnerships, and we're very focused on education is a huge opportunity, obviously. E-government is a huge opportunity. As you point out, you have a lot of not only governments that are now very focused on using technology to drive their national priorities, but also you have a number of growing companies who are willing to use technology. So I think fundamentally we are going to continue to grow our presence really across the board, sales, service, manufacturing, and R&D.
And the same for Cisco, dependent on a stable Middle East?
Well, even I would argue part of the way that you get a stable Middle East is a rising middle class, an environment where 60% of your population is under 20 and doesn't see an economic future. So I think what you're going to see is it is a very good area for IT investments. In fact, you'll see companies like HP and Cisco working together on common projects. It would not surprise me to see the most sophisticated, fastest network in the world built in the Middle East over the next 2 years. You will see us go into areas like Jordan with the Jordanian educational initiative that was hatched last year at this session, to where 50 of us came together in 24 real core groups and focused on how do we really drive the education all the way through the process, and to create an environment that works in Jordan where you've got very enlightened leadership and good universities, and then take that throughout not just the rest of the Middle East and around the world. So I think what you're seeing is a high-tech industry that is very open to both investing where growth can be, but also, we tend to dream in Silicon Valley a little bit, creating a more stable political environment by creating economic hope for people who perhaps don't have it today.
Laura, do you want to come in on this one?
Well, I would only say I just happened to have a wonderful opportunity to be involved with the Jeddah Economic Forum, and I was very, very impressed by the development plans of Jordan and the development plans of Saudi Arabia. And I do think there is an absolute recognition among those planners of the opportunity here to use IT, again, as a way to sort of what's happened before in technological revolutions, to kind of leapfrog. This is a moment when they can do that. And you can combine the human talent, which we all agree is age appropriate in some way to the technology. That is, this is a very young population, yes, and they can use this technology extremely effectively.
I also think your idea in Oman, by the way, shows great potential, if you put it that way. But I'm sure you can talk about that a bit later. Some more questions. Hold on, Gary, you go first.
I just wanted to interject real quickly on that same question. I mean, our business is no different. Middle East and the, part of what we call our emerging region of Europe, Middle East and Africa. But Middle East is a high growth market. I think it is for most U.S.-based tech companies that have put some investment there. One of the things I think you have to look at there is one of the opportunities relative to this leapfrogging notion is some of the legacy infrastructure is not there. So some of having to deal with past structures and past networks and past configurations, in many parts of the Middle East, you actually get to start new. And so the speed of adoption and the speed at which you can get some of the benefit actually increases if you don't have to deal with the legacy past. And a good example, that's the difficulties in the U.S. market because of the packet-based networks and phone-based networks and switch-based networks that we've had for phones. It's easier to get, if you go into Asia, it's easier to get high-speed internet access in Asia than it is in most hotels in the U.S. And it has to do with where they were starting with and how much legacy infrastructure they had to accommodate as they thought about expanding out and using technology to the benefit. So I actually think some of these parts of the world, Middle East as an example, has a huge opportunity for leapfrogging and to get immense benefit without all the cost and complexity of the past.
Indeed. Any more questions? The gentleman at the back there.
George Colony, Forrester Research. Question for the whole panel. In this decade, will there be a company that starts up and goes to $1 billion in size in this decade, as Microsoft did in the 80s and Cisco did in the 90s?
Well, let's go along the panel. Gary?
Well, I'm probably from the smallest of the companies here. So, my belief is there will be. I don't, this notion that innovation's dead and that there's not going to be new companies coming out, I absolutely think there will be. There's always opportunity in the technology industry to out-innovate or to come up with some new idea and grow a very successful, rapidly growing company. When you talk about over 10 years, that's a long time to get to $1 billion. And it's been done many times, and it was done by many companies before there was a bubble. If you really think about it, in fact, Cisco, I spent years at Oracle, being a Veritas executive now, the CEO of Veritas, these are all companies that grew, approached the $1 billion or exceeded it without a bubble at all. And I don't think that the future is any different on that front.
I think it's going to shock you how many companies there are that achieve that. We believe that if you take a new idea from concept to the $1 billion, it takes 5 to 7 years with world-class execution. Brand has an advantage in doing that. But we're seeing that in our storage business. We're seeing it in IP telephony. We're seeing it in security. We're seeing it in the home network. If you're a fast follower, you can let somebody start to mine the market, and then you jump in, and you can probably do it in a shorter window. This next part may surprise you. I think you will see the next HPs, Cisco's, Veritases founded during this slowdown. Because during the boom, the venture capitalists and our companies ended up supporting 10 to 20 companies in a given area. Most VCs will tell you once you get past 5, it's inefficient. So I think with a limited amount of money being invested, you actually have a much higher probability of the next generation of companies being generated over the last couple of years than you did during the boom where there was unbelievable capital being thrown at it.
I think the principal difference going forward as compared to the boom years is not, are there companies that can go from 0 to $1 billion? Because I absolutely agree with Gary and John. Absolutely, there are going to be companies that go from 0 to $1 billion. I think the difference is there will be very few companies that bump along at 100 or 200 or 300 million. In other words, scope and scale does matter, particularly when you're dealing with these complex technology problems that require a lot of interoperability and interaction. And so what I think you're going to see, maybe more returning to normalcy, is the burnout rate. Yeah, you're going to have some companies that succeed, but you won't have a large number of companies that can keep going on relatively low volume in an intensely competitive industry. So the failure rates are going to be more normal, certainly higher than they were in the boom years.
Take the question a bit further on, Carly. Do you see any future corporate marriages on the scale of yours with Compact?
Oh, you know, I mean, never say never, but I think good mergers, and I would classify ours as good, good mergers are driven by very specific strategic objectives. And that requires an understanding of the particular environment in which a company is operating, the particular competitive challenges they're facing. So I don't I don't happen to believe in something that people talk a lot about. Well, it's a merger time. This is when companies merge. I think a merger will only work if it has a very specific strategic purpose attached to it.
And you feel your merger has been successfully completed. So who have you got in your sights now?
Well, maybe nobody.
Let me comment on that as well. I'm a person that really believes in acquisitions. We've done 70 of them. But I didn't have the courage to do a large acquisition. Most all of them fell. I think Carly's merger has been very successful and very well executed, but she picked a point in time and executed well. But I think what you are going to see is this environment is going to consolidate. There'll be less $100 million players, but there are also going to be less $5 and $10 billion players. And so what's going to be interesting is it going to be like musical chairs where people just slowly don't find a chair in the marketplace as it consolidates, or are they going to learn to get together? So some companies may be driven together for economy reasons, much in the financing industry.
Any examples?
I think it would be inappropriate speculation, but yes, I have several. A couple of my competitors come to mind. But I think you want to remember Carly's company.
I won't tell anybody.
Carly's company is the only one where you've seen large mergers work well. And so her execution was an A. But I think it will be the exception. However, I think the market will force it because of economic scale and consolidation in the musical chairs that I talked about. So I think you're going to see a decade of consolidation.
Okay. Any more questions?
Just another comment on that one. If you bridge that back to the tech industry, we shouldn't forget what the IT leaders, how their role is and what they're doing to drive some of this consolidation, in particular when John talks about $100 and $200 million companies, because what IT leaders are looking for is to do business with a smaller number of vendors that offer a broader set of solutions. A typical IT shop, 3-5 years ago, that particular CIO might have had 50 to 100 vendors that are supplying technology to run their shop. Today, most of them are talking about, can I get that down to 20? Now, I don't think it's going to go to 1. I don't think it's going to go to 2, but I don't think it's going to be 50 either. And if it's not going to be 50 and it's going to be 20, then that suggests in itself pretty massive consolidation of the smaller players out of the industry. And I think we've already seen that starting.
Laura, it's been a fairly tough time for IT managers, but just to sort of round this off this afternoon, do you think the focus on cutting costs has been a really healthy exercise for most companies? The companies, I think, that overbought technology in the boom 90s.
Well, I guess I would start by saying whether it was really healthy or not, it was essential and therefore almost by definition healthy, because much of it was done for reasons of survival. I mean, it was the case that firms did, and they did run up the investment very quickly. We've talked a lot about the lags involved in getting the results. They certainly were confronted. I mean, I was thinking about IT spend for a minute from the point of view of, again, I sit on some boards, and I sit on one large telco board, and they slashed their IT spend. Now, they slashed their IT spend in part for, there's a sectoral element we didn't discuss here, which is sort of the collapse of the telecommunications industry was a major issue for a lot of the IT suppliers. So the regulatory issues in telecom, a lot of issues for the IT suppliers. But the point is, what these companies did was, when their revenues lines basically took a deep plunge, it was necessary, absolutely necessary, to spend a lot of management, focus, time, energy on the cost side of the equation. That was the only room. That was where you had room for maneuver. Now I think that as the revenue line starts to look healthier and come back, yes, you've created you have spent time creating a more efficient structure and probably wringing out some of that productivity, which you might not have done had the environment not put this incredible competitive pressure on you to do so. So it enhanced the productivity implementation, recognition of the potential. Mm-hmm.
I think in hindsight it was a very healthy experience, although I wish we'd figured a way to go through it smoother. And I think most IT organizations would agree on that.
I think we'd all agree on that.
But what happened was, when you're growing at a given rate, if you pursue a very conservative strategy, you don't get to even participate in the race. So if you're running the Indy 500 and you're going 100 miles around the track, you're left behind before the race even gets early on. But the market changed, and it changed to a Tour de France type of environment with starts and stops. And so I think the IT changes that have taken place over the last 3 years back to the basics were very healthy. Stephen, it wasn't just a budget issue. It was back to the basics that you don't get the leverage unless you change process, and I think people understanding that. It was also an issue you don't get the leverage unless you have a common data architecture, one view of your customer, one view of your employees, one view of your supply chain. And it forced people to really rethink the central requirements that had to be changed. And so you now have it back to 20 or 30 years ago with a CIO czar who better deliver for the CEO on one hand, on the other hand will really control a lot of the perhaps lessons learned over the last decade.
Let's have some a final question from the floor. The gentleman at the back, and this will be the last question.
Thank you. My name is Humberto. I'm from Brazil. I'm a tech entrepreneur there. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about the outsourcing and offshoring movement that we are perceiving all over the world right now.
No, I understand your question, and I think it's an entirely accurate question, and it's one I was going to ask. But
I'm sorry for
time. No, it's a great question. I'm glad you raised it, and I want John to kick off about offshoring, as you call it in America. I mean, when we talk offshore in Britain, we mean banks and hiding money. But in Britain, we call it outsourcing. But I know exactly what you mean. It's going to be an issue. It could be an issue in the presidential election. It's beginning to be a political issue in Britain. How do you see it? Do you see outsourcing continuing for the next 20 years?
I think what you're going to see is a changing business model, whether you call it the network virtual organization as we refer to it at Cisco or otherwise, and it will be a core versus context environment where companies have to realize what their core competency is sustainable, and what others can do more effectively, called context, you do through partners. But you've got to do it not in an outsourcing model, but in what I'd call an out-tasking model, where you maintain control of the data architecture, the strategy, and you get your partner to implement it. This is where I think the jobs over time will go where the best educated workforce is, with the right infrastructure. I think that's a very healthy thing to occur on a global basis, as long as let me just finish the thought and then jump right into it, Stephen. As long as it happens at a reasonable pace. If it happens too fast, then you can have the political environment overreact to it.
I don't understand a reasonable pace. I mean, people outsource and that's it. But the point being, are you saying both ends benefit?
Yes, I do. I think this is a win-win if done right, and if governments go about it the right way and businesses go about it the right way. Laura, you've given that a lot of thought and conversations on it.
Well, I think there is a lot of talk about this here. I would say that all I would say is there's the sanguine view and there's the pessimistic view. The sanguine view actually goes along the lines of what my first comment was, which actually what outsourcing well done does is it drives prices down and it drives productivity up. And prices down and productivity up are net wins. They're net wins for consumers. They spread the technology. They increase demand. They enhance the productivity of all of the using organizations, which further reduces prices. And you have a wonderful, virtuous creation of wealth, which is global. The pessimistic view, which is not necessarily at odds with this, but it's just a different way of looking at it, is that out-tasking or outsourcing really means that there's a huge increase in the supply of technically sophisticated workers, workers who are skilled enough to do a lot of jobs which are currently only done in certain high-wage environments. And what that will do is it will depress the wage premium of the countries that currently are the only doers, because they only have they really have the labor supply. But if all of a sudden there's a massive increase in that labor supply and the employers around the world can tap into the labor wherever it is, you might have an increase in global income and global wealth, but with quite different or quite new distributional characteristics. You might have a large number of losers and a relatively small number of winners in a given developed economy, let's say. Now, you might have lots of winners in emerging market economies, but in a given developed economy, you might have a large number of losers. And that's a very interesting political and social set of issues.
And it depends
Very
how
briefly,
companies
John.
and countries react to it. Within Cisco, as an example, when we outsource, we move jobs that somebody else can do more effectively, and we retrain the employee for a different job. And so I think it's the social responsibility as well as the country creating the stimulus to encourage to keep jobs as well.
I just want to hear from Carly and Gary on this.
So very quickly, I think part of the difficulty with this discussion is a lot of terms get thrown around that sometimes mean different things. So I would distinguish first between outsourcing and offshoring. Outsourcing is generally the practice where a company chooses to have work that it used to do itself done by others. And that is a question of what John was referring earlier, where a company may say, my core competence is no longer in running my own data center. I want to partner with someone else to do that. Or my core competence is not in offering this entire technology portfolio. I'm going to concentrate on this bit and let someone else concentrate on the other bit. And outsourcing can go on between companies, and it has nothing to do with moving people around the globe. It may, but it doesn't necessarily. Offshoring, of course, is when work is sent to another shore. And inside HP, we happen to operate in 176 countries. It is a huge advantage to us to be able to participate in all of the markets and to tap into all of the talents of people in 176 countries. 60% of our revenue comes from outside the U.S., and when we grow our revenue outside the U.S., that's good for everyone in our company. So we talk about right shoring. And what right shoring means to us is we want to put the right kind of work in the right place, matched to the customer's requirements and matched to the population's skills. This notion of right shoring or offshoring happens to be, I think, a huge competitive advantage for Brazil going forward. And we happen to be working with a number of ministers in Brazil around how to create some competence in Brazil around this area. Having said that, it raises the premium for every country to invest in its own competitiveness. The reality is every country now is operating on a global scale and has to compete on a global scale. And so just as companies have to think about how they're really going to compete and invest in their competitiveness, so I think countries do as well. Companies invest in their competitiveness by investing in training and education, investing in improving their value add through R&D or innovation. Countries have to do the same. Education, training, R&D, how do I use technology to drive productivity? And I think that's a new world where countries literally have to think about themselves in competitive terms. Technology companies have had to think about themselves in those terms for a long time, and the downturn made us think even more deeply about ourselves in those terms. And now I think countries have to think about that.
Gary, you can talk either about out-tasking, outsourcing, offshoring, or right-shoring.
Well, I'll kind of talk about all four of them, but all combined.
Okay.
Right? So I think Carly gave a great definition of which each of them are. But if you look at it and you go back to the topic of the session, leveraging technology, we shouldn't forget that while this has become a political hot potato in many parts of the world, this whole question, don't forget that this is leverage from technology. We couldn't do much of this 20 years ago because we didn't have the networks and we didn't have the connectivity in order to allow it to happen. So there's multiple drivers of it today. One is we are leveraging technology. We do engineering, like HP and I'm sure like Cisco. We do it in multiple places. We have an operation in Israel. We have an operation in Pune, India. So we're in multiple places enabled by technology. We're leveraging technology. We're leveraging the fact that we're a global business. And so we're operating globally, meaning we're building software and we're engineering technology globally. And then I would just point out relative to the U.S., the real reason we've kind of looked at it aggressively out of the U.S. is because of the access not to lower cost, but to great talent. And if you look at the pipeline of engineering grads and the pipeline of science and math interests in U.S. education system, they're simply not generating enough to feed the pipeline for engineering degrees. If we want the U.S. economy to continue to expand, we have to think globally to tap into a broader engineering pool.
All right, thank you, Gary, and thank you for the question. It's an important one, and I'm glad we had time for it. The questions were levering technology for the bottom line. I made some notes. I said earlier rebound might be an overly aggressive word, but then anything better than recent history would be an improvement. I'm as certain as I can be that I'm really very positive, in fact. We are unlikely to see the exuberance of the 90s again. The NASDAQ, which gets more than 40% of its value from computer-related shares, has added 2%, a level I don't think has been seen for a couple of years. I don't think, despite the gloom and doom, that IT is reaching its days of maturity. I think that's a long way off. And it's strange to read so much debate about tech's value just as it exploded onto the rebound. From new orders and some better than expected profits to the rise of promising technologies such as wireless internet, Linux software, digital entertainment, which is a key entertainment in my view. It means, as far as I'm concerned, the longish IT cold snap seems to be thawing fast. Many IT buyers, I think, are still refusing to buy anything that won't guarantee a return in less than 6 months. So there is a degree of skepticism out there. I think the garden is looking rosier, but don't expect the spending days of the late 90s. It's not quite time to go out and roll in the hay in the sunshine. I think you should pretty much take an umbrella with you. That would be my message. Gary Bloom, John Chambers, Carly Fiorina, and Laura Tyson, thank you all very much indeed, and thanks to you.